Imagine that you spent years building the largest commercial monopoly in the world, that you had sailed halfway around the globe, won impossible battles, established fortresses on 3 continents, controlling entire oceans. Now imagine that all of this started to fall apart because of a single book. That's exactly what happened to Portugal at the end of the 16th century. A young Dutchman named Jan Ruygen van Linschoten spent years embedded in the heart of the Portuguese Empire in India. With access to secret maps, maritime routes, and commercial information that Portugal had kept under lock and key for decades. And when he published all of this in a book, the Portuguese monopoly was never the same again. But after all, who was this man? How did he manage to infiltrate the Portuguese Empire? What secrets did he reveal? And why was his book considered the greatest threat Portugal had ever faced? In today's video, we're going to talk about the story of Jan Ruygen van Linschoten and the simple mistake made by Portugal, which allowed a spy to achieve what cannons and fleets without him could never accomplish. But before we start the video, if you enjoy our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live sessions with us to dive even deeper into the hidden side of history. To understand what Linschoten did, we first need to understand what Portugal had built. As we've already mentioned here on the channel, starting with Vasco da Gama and with the military genius of Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese completely dominated the Indian Ocean. They controlled Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Goa in India, and a series of fortresses scattered along the African and Indian coasts. But this dominance didn't depend only on cannons and ships. It depended on something much more powerful: secrecy and the right techniques. The Portuguese nautical routes were considered state secrets. The maps that showed the winds, currents, reefs, the best times to sail, all of that was strictly guarded. Revealing or smuggling this information to a foreign government was considered treason, and since the time of Dom João II, it was punishable by death. And for decades, the system worked. The English and the Dutch tried to sail to the Indies and got lost, shipwrecked, or returned empty-handed. The Portuguese maintained the monopoly not only by force, but also by their exclusive knowledge of how to get there, until a young Dutchman appeared. Jan Huygens van Linschoten was born in 1563 in Haarlem, in the Netherlands. The son of a notary of modest means, from a young age he showed an insatiable curiosity for stories of travel and adventure. At the age of 16, with no clear plan, he left the Netherlands in search of a life of adventure with his brothers. And so he ended up in Seville, where his older brothers had established a business. In 1580, when Philip II of Spain marched to take over Portugal during the Iberian Union, Linschoten and his brothers followed the army in search of opportunities. That's when the opportunity that would change everything arises. His brother Willem knew the newly appointed Archbishop of Goa in Portuguese India, and Linschoten gets an appointment as the Archbishop's private secretary. That's where it gets interesting. It may seem strange that a young Dutchman could get a position at the heart of the Portuguese Empire, but it wasn't. Portugal was a small kingdom with less than 1 million inhabitants, ruling an empire that spread across 4 continents. And for that, from time to time, they used the services of specialized foreigners. Amerigo Vespucci himself mapped the coasts of Brazil in the service of Dom Manuel. And in the case of Linschoten, he had writing and language skills that would be very useful for bureaucratic work. And so in 1583, he set sail for Portugal, for Goa. 5 months later, he was in the heart of the Portuguese Empire in the east. For 5 years, from 1583 to 1588, Linschoten lived in Goa as the Archbishop's secretary. And there, with privileged access to the structures of Portuguese power, he did what no non-Portuguese European had managed to do before. He kept a detailed diary. Day after day, he wrote everything down. The sea routes, the trading posts, the relationships between the Portuguese and the Indian kingdoms, the strengths and weaknesses of the fortresses. And above all, he copied maps. Those maps were the most valuable treasure of the empire. Nautical charts that accurately showed the seasonal winds of the Indian Ocean, the monsoons that determined when and how to sail, the dangerous reefs, the safe harbors, the routes through the Strait of Malacca, the passages to the Spice Islands. They were documents that Portugal had kept secret for almost a century and that had cost the lives of hundreds of navigators to create, and they were the true foundation of the Portuguese monopoly. And Jan van Linschoten, with his position as secretary to the archbishop, gained access to them and copied them methodically. And with the death of the archbishop in 1587, his mission in Goa came to an end. But the material he had collected was extremely valuable. The journey back to the Netherlands was not easy. During the stopover in the Azores, the English were besieging the island and John van Linschoten was stuck there for 2 years. And during that period, he took the opportunity to map the city of Angra with the same methodical rigor he had applied in Goa. When he finally arrived in Holland in 1592, he brought with him all the knowledge of the eastern routes. And in 1596, he published the Itinerary, a book that detailed for the first time to the European public the maritime routes to the East Indies, the secrets of Asian trade, the maps of the coasts, the winds and the currents. And the impact was immediate and devastating for Portugal. Everything that Lisbon had protected for decades as a state secret was now printed and available to any European reader. The Itinerary was translated into English in 1598 and into Latin in 1599, as well as into French in 1610. Within a few years, the Portuguese monopoly on nautical knowledge had evaporated, and the consequences were immediate. Linschoten's own data was used in the preparation of the first Dutch fleet to Asia, commanded by Cornelis Holtman between 1595 and 1592, which sailed the route suggested by the Dutchman south of Madagascar towards the island of Java, exactly as he had described in the Itinerary. And more than that, Schoten had suggested something crucial, that Dutch merchants approach the Indies from the south, through the Sunda Strait, minimizing the risk of Portuguese intervention. This passage eventually became the main Dutch route to Southeast Asia. And so, it was done. This was the origin of the colonization of the territories that make up present-day Indonesia. In this way, the Dutch with this knowledge suddenly knew exactly where to attack and with whom to form alliances. They knew, for example, that in Sri Lanka, King Vimaladhar Masurya hated the Portuguese, which led the Dutch commander Jan Joris van Spilbergen to form an alliance with him. The war between Portugal and the Netherlands was not only commercial, it was also religious. The Iberian Catholics and the Dutch Protestants hated each other in Europe, and this hatred spread throughout the East. The local kings who resisted Portuguese rule saw the Dutch as natural allies, not just commercial competitors. Linschoten knew this and documented exactly who each king was that Portugal's enemies should ally themselves with. And so they knew exactly which local leaders didn't get along with the Portuguese, and the Dutch went straight to them to establish their own rule, expanding right on the heels of the Portuguese. The rivalry and desire for riches was such that, more than once, the Dutch promised not to spread their religion in Asia and to ally themselves with pagan kings to fight against the Portuguese Catholic missions. In this way, in 1605, they took control of the Spice Island, in 1639 of Ceylon, and in 1641 of Malacca. And so, what Dutch cannons and fleets couldn't destroy in decades of failed attempts, a single book managed to do in just a few years. But Linschoten didn't stop at the Itinerario. He also published works about the coast of Guinea, Angola, and even Cape of Santo Agostinho in Brazil, mapping the Portuguese possessions in Africa and America with the same rigor. And he didn't just stay in the East. In 1594, he took part in an expedition to the Arctic, led by the Dutch cartographer William Barents, searching for a northeast passage above Siberia towards China. The expedition was forced to turn back because of the icebergs, but Linschoten also published detailed accounts of this adventure. His talent was not that of a navigator or a warrior, but that of a methodical observer, someone who understood that power lay in information, and that published information could reorder the world. And that's exactly what happened. The case of Linschoten tells us something very profound about how empires really work and how they lose their hegemonies. Portugal built its monopoly on the pillars of military force and the secrecy of knowledge and techniques. And when the second disappeared, the first, already weakened by the Iberian Union and the Dutch wars, was not enough to sustain the structure. And the great paradox is that it was precisely the structure of the empire that created the vulnerability. With a small population, Portugal always hired foreigners to serve the crown. But by the end of the 16th century, the religious dynamics and the rivalry between the kingdoms did not allow for any mistakes. And it was through this gap that a 20-year-old Dutchman entered, willing to write down everything he saw. Linschoten never fired a cannon, never commanded a fleet, never conquered a fortress, but his journey was enough to dismantle the Portuguese Empire in the East. And you? Did you know the story of Jan Huygen van Linschoten? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work. And take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history